1945. Hitler is dead, Japan has surrendered, the Second World War has been won by the Allied powers. But another world war has already begun, a secret one that will give birth to new secret armies of spies in vast espionage organizations infiltrating the world in a way never seen before. CIA, MI6, KGB, or DGSE, acronyms that immediately conjure images of secrecy, danger, and the far-reaching unseen hand of government power. While MI6 and KGB trace their history back to the First World War, in the form we think of them today, they are all products of the Second World War, and only grew to truly powerful international organizations during the Cold War. It is Britain and His Majesty's government, led by Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin's Politburo of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics who will give birth to modern espionage. But wait, you say. Isn't espionage as old as conflict? And haven't spy networks been part of history since the dawn of civilization? That is true. The ancient Egyptians, the Greek city-states, the Chinese emperors, the Romans, and many more used organized espionage. It's pretty safe to say that virtually every ruler or regime in history has used spies. And entrepreneurs, traders, and powerful private individuals have spied on each other. However, it is only with the Second World War that we see the emergence of organizations of this new caliber, centrally controlled by a government and with international reach. In fact, this modern age of intelligence and counterintelligence begins November 9, 1939, at a border crossing between Germany and the Netherlands on the outskirts of the Dutch city Venlo.
It is an hour before sunset. As the cloudy November skies darken, 4 men are waiting in a car in the parking lot of a cafe. They are here for a secret meeting that they hope may avert the worst of a world war. That war, World War II, is only 2 months old, and the British Secret Intelligence Service, the SIS, informally soon to be known publicly as MI6, has picked up murmurs of discontent within the Wehrmacht and a plan to depose Hitler. Better still, a certain Dr. Franz Fischer, a German refugee from Nazism in the Netherlands, has told the SIS that a conspiracy of Wehrmacht officers plotting to overthrow Hitler might even be willing to negotiate a peace treaty before the young war gets out of hand. Fischer has gone as far as bringing some of these officers to secret meetings with Dutch military intelligence and SIS agents Sigismund Payne Best and Richard Henry Stevens. On November 8th, they meet Fischer and a certain Hauptmann Schemmel, a Wehrmacht captain that promises the next day he will introduce him to a general at the heart of the coup. Later that same day, by complete coincidence, a lone actor, Georg Elser, tries but fails to kill Hitler with a bomb during a speech on the anniversary of the Hitler-Ludendorff putsch attempt in Munich. This lends even more credence to the coup rumours, and the next day's meeting becomes an even higher priority. The meeting will take place on the outskirts of Venlo, at a cafe right next to the border crossing, where the general can travel without arousing suspicion on the German side. Best, Stevens, and their Dutch contact Dirk Klopp and his driver have been dispatched for the 4 p.m. meeting. But it's a deception. There is no general. There is no planned coup. Fischer is a double agent under coercion for the SS counter-espionage. And Hauptmann Schemmel is in reality a high-ranking SS operative, Walter Schellenberg. When the Brits and Dutch arrive at the parking lot of the cafe, a car packed with SS agents speeds up and the agents pour out. A firefight ensues. Klopp is mortally wounded. The driver and the 2 SIS agents are abducted and taken across the border into Germany, where they will languish in concentration camps until they are liberated in early May 1945. For Schellenberg, it is a career-defining moment. And for British intelligence, and indeed for world intelligence, it will change everything.
The Venlo incident had 2 other effects. First of all, of course, the MI6 was very embarrassed, tightened up their own operations. But a more severe, what I would consider a more severe impact was that because the involvement of Schellenberg in the Venlo interest changed the architecture of the SS and the SD.
The incident will be one of the key events that changes espionage forever. And it's the first escalation in an espionage war that will paralyze both German and British intelligence gathering for the better part of the war. In an age of increasingly fast communication, it sets off a domino effect. Capture one spy, use them to gather more information, including when the next one is to arrive, capture them, and find out about the next one, and so on. The captured agents are either turned, forced to work under duress and torture, or killed. During Operation Nordpol, from late 1941 to October 1943, the German Abwehr intercept virtually every British agent dropped into the Netherlands. The agents' codebooks, their radios, and in some cases the agents themselves are then used to transmit false information and receive intelligence from the unwitting handlers in Great Britain. Over 40 British and Dutch agents are killed during the operation. Most of them die as captives in the Nazi concentration camp system. On the British side, MI5 counterintelligence of the SIS will operate Section 20, or double cross, after the two X's in the Roman numeral 20. That will have the effect of completely eliminating German intelligence on the British Isles, as every single German agent sent in either defects, is turned, or incarcerated. At the core of these operations is a recent technological innovation that has completely changed human culture in only 2 decades: the radio.
Of course, spies have always existed. In history, we have very famous spies like Mata Hari, Sir Francis Walsingham, or Bell Boyd. We even have spy rings like the Culper spy ring during the American Revolutionary War. But what was really new was an institutional, state-driven, international, connected espionage organization that had never existed before, or at least not before World War I and the Soviet Revolution. Many things drove the development of espionage into a modern variety of it. But if I have to single out one thing that was really the main driver, I would say radio. Because with radio, we suddenly had the ability to intercept information from the enemy far beyond just having to capture a letter or steal a letter or break in and take the letter. Now we could capture it, we could decrypt it, and hence encryption and decryption during the interwar era saw an enormous amount of development.
At the beginning of the war, this was the main area of work for the SIS and its newly appointed head, Colonel Stuart Graham Mingus. Cracking German communications has been a major goal of the Western Allies for some years already, but that means breaking what is arguably history's most infamous encryption machine, Enigma. This multi-layered, mechanical device is so complex that by some it is considered unbreakable. At least the Germans think so.
There was no doubt in any heart that anyone, especially the British, would be able to make sense of it. Nobody thought that was even possible. And you have to consider that German engineers in the beginning of the century, they were so full of themselves. Whatever they invented, right, was so superior, technical-wise, that no, and not the British. Come on. No, they would never have thought that.
Ciphers and settings for Enigma have already been leaking out of Germany as early as 1931 through one Hans Thilo Schmidt, a cipher office worker who has been selling ciphers and documentation to the French for cash. Rather than the French, though, it's actually the Polish who managed to make the most use out of this information. Before the fall of Poland, all the crucial advances are shared with the British, who continue their own cryptanalysis work at Bletchley Park. This may yet prove to be Britain's best chance of getting ahead in the intelligence war. But there's a hitch. Cryptographers hacking away at the code is not enough. As Schmidt has shown, you need success in the field to provide a basis for the code breaking. After the failure of Venlo, it is clear that success in the field is not guaranteed, and Mingus sees the need to adapt and improve. British intelligence as a whole is still very much stuck in its ways from its first exploits during the height of the Anglo-German naval arms race that predated the First World War. It lacks proper structure, its networks tend to be small and disparate, and the primary focus is on intelligence gathering and observation rather than operations that could really make a difference to the war effort. And this is not unique to the British. American MI8, which was by most reckoning a state-of-the-art espionage organization for its time, was shut down in 1929 by then Secretary of State Henry Stimson, who felt spying was ungentlemanly.
Spying was ungentlemanly. You know, this was not a profession. This was frowned upon. You know, you don't listen to conversations at the next door table. No, we don't do this.
Without a doubt, the whole world suffered under a naive illusion that espionage was only something that the bad people did. That went for the U.S. as much as anybody else, and perhaps even more for the U.S. Before the war started, the American intelligence services was basically encryption and decryption.
By 1940, the US Army Signal Intelligence Service has started breaking some Japanese diplomatic codes, and the Navy has a section based at Pearl Harbor working on intercepting Japanese communiques and deciphering them, Station Hypo. This section is rather primitive compared to the system that Mingus is building in Britain. For a long while, automated computing is entirely out of the question, and the section is little more than rows of desks manned by cryptologists working with pencils and paper. It's tedious, slow work that is hardly fit for an age when time-critical enemy messages can cross entire oceans and continents in seconds. To make matters worse, there is little to no central coordination. Army and Navy intelligence more or less do their own thing and rarely communicate at all. If they are talking, they're certainly not sharing intelligence methods and their own decryption breakthroughs with one another. This turns out to be one of the key reasons why the Japanese assault at Pearl Harbor is never sufficiently predicted. In a final irony, if the US would have cracked the relevant Japanese codes, it's very unlikely that the Japanese would have discovered that they were compromised. Japan's own intelligence is well on the decline. It had actually been quite effective in the interwar years, with Japan employing a number of inventive and effective tactics to gain intelligence on the US Pacific Fleet, such as having fishing ships report on the US West Coast and exchange students in California intercepting and quizzing drunken US sailors. They now struggle to match the Allies in their espionage efforts. Intelligence cells that had been established in the 1930s are now left in the lurch as US counterintelligence snap them up, and no attempt is made to transfer their work to new agents. Like in America, there is a feeling that espionage is dishonorable. Moreover, the prevailing thoughts in Japanese politics of the time circle around racial, imperial, and cultural superiority. Analyzing and exploiting the strengths and weaknesses of other nations and cultures is not compatible with that ideological dogma. The intelligence work that Japan is still trying to do is hampered by these quirks. Japanese intelligence personnel are trained to show strict ideological discipline, unquestioning loyalty, and reverence for the military hierarchy, as are all Japanese military. These, unfortunately, are not the best traits for would-be spies, and it leads to a culture of exaggerating success and underreporting failure for the sake of keeping their superior officers happy.
The Japanese very much embodied the attitude towards espionage outside of the Soviet Union and the whole world just before the war breaks out. It's considered simply dishonorable to spy on other people. It's considered treasonous, and they wrongfully assumed that this is how the whole world saw it. And tragically, the inability of the Japanese to run effective espionage contributed to their inability to surrender at the end of the war, which in turn led to the dropping of the atomic bombs. And I think that here, in the case of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we see a very clear example of how intelligence could have saved hundreds and thousands of people if the Japanese leadership had understood what was going on at the side of the enemy.
I think one thing you see in the Second World War is so much hubris and disbelief that someone could crack your code or could figure out what you're thinking. I can definitely say that certainly swung a lot of things more in the Allied favor than they would have been otherwise.
On the Asian mainland, on the other hand, a long tradition of espionage exists. The vast bureaucracies of the Chinese empires were always rife with espionage between different factions, and that has changed little since the last emperor was deposed in 1912. Under direction of Dai Li on the nationalist side and Zhou Enlai on the communist side, Chinese intelligence is able to thrive throughout the war, and the number of active agents and infiltrators reach into the hundreds of thousands, spying not only on the Japanese, but also on each other. Their war, however, is mostly contained inside the vast stretches of China, and Chinese espionage does not reach far outside of its borders.
The Chinese suffered under the problem that they were fighting three wars at the same time. They were fighting one war against Japan, they were fighting one war against each other, and a third war against the Japanese representative, again, each other. So they were really not in a situation to create anything like what grew in the rest of the world during this time.
In the Soviet Union, the Narodny Commissariat Vnutrenny Del, People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, or NKVD, is hard at work spying both inside and outside the USSR. It's a behemoth of an organization that encompasses, among other things, the Ministry of the Interior, the Secret Police, the Regular Police, the Fire Brigades, Prison and Labor Camp Administration, Border Security, and more, including intelligence gathering. It was established as a successor organization to the Joint State Political Directorate in 1934, but like in China, it has roots in imperial tradition by way of the original Cheka, the Soviet Police of 1917, its creator Felix Dzerzhinsky, and the Civil War.
Yeah, the Soviet system is an interesting one because it grows out of the Russian secret police, the Tsarist secret police, which was not oriented towards the international stage in any way, but it was oriented towards spying on the communists. And the communists very much copied that when they came to power in 1917, and eventually Dzerzhinsky created the Cheka. It was very much in the Russian culture to have this kind of information gathering, spying on other people, collecting the information, giving it on to a central place. That was already there.
The Soviets have one advantage with foreign spying that other nations do not: the nature of their ideology. Communist theory tends to place loyalty to the ideology above that of loyalty to your nation. With the worldwide growth of communist parties that coalesce around Lenin's and Trotsky's Socialist International, and from there become more or less loyal to the USSR, the Soviets have an organic political network to build an intelligence network on. Their effort again borrows on the Russian traditions of centrally led but independent cells to gather information. These cells of resident spies, or residentures, like viruses traveling the bloodstream, spread secretly alongside the Soviets' growing diplomatic missions, and by the outbreak of war, they have fanned out across the world, including to the US and to Great Britain.
With communism being a more or less international movement and having sympathizers in the US, in Britain, in France, in Italy, wherever, the Soviet Union knew how to harness and leverage that to its own advantage. From the early 30s onwards, we had illegal and legal aliens, which is a Soviet intelligence lingo for spies that have an official cover at the Soviet embassy and work in an official position, spying. Or you have people whose identities have been changed and have then been sent to the United States to blend into civil society and spy from there.
one of the most influential groups of such sympathizers has grown in Great Britain, the Cambridge Five. During the war, the group's information-gathering tendrils will come to reach deep into the British Cabinet Office, the Foreign Office, and the SIS.
You know, the 5 blokes coming from Cambridge, they're all between 23 and 26. They dissolved in British society, you know, being normal guys, very intelligent, very well-bred, you know. So they had a good reputation, and why should you suspect something, you know? Okay, they were communists, my God, you know, every university was full of them, and they blah, 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 you know, but that was it.
Partly they're able to go this deep because the British focus is entirely on fighting the Axis. And after Operation Barbarossa, the Soviets are an ally. And why would an ally pose an intelligence threat? This almost blind British intelligence focus on the Axis is arguably a natural consequence of Britain's situation. Before Germany invades the USSR, and Japan's attacks on the US and the British Commonwealth in the Pacific bring the British Commonwealth, US, China, and the USSR together as a United Nations alliance, things look quite bleak for the British. Despite some success with breaking Enigma, it looks to be a lengthy and arduous process, and that will take time. Time that Britain may not have. The Germans are still winning the war. British land operations in the Mediterranean and North Africa are failing. London is still being pounded by the Luftwaffe. They must adapt, and quickly, or risk losing the war altogether. And there are 2 people who are eager to make that change. Soon-to-be Prime Minister Winston Churchill and his associate, multimillionaire entrepreneur William Little Bill Stevenson. Now, after Venlo, future Prime Minister Churchill and many others are suspicious of SIS capabilities. It's both down to the failures that followed Venlo and frustration at not being able to act on the gathered intelligence other than inform the military. By mid-1940, there is also a widespread public fear of Nazi agents infiltrating every aspect of British society by the thousands. Churchill calls it spy mania, and although he knows it's an exaggerated fear, a total of 25 German agents have landed in Great Britain by this time, the government will use the spy mania to their advantage and engage the public to make it virtually impossible for German agents to go unnoticed. They will capture them and possibly turn them. Furthermore, Churchill dreams of a paramilitary force that the government can deploy covertly, outside the confines of rigid military hierarchies and parliamentary oversight. Thus, right after Churchill moves into 10 Downing Street, 2 new organisations come into existence. First, the 20 Committee, under leadership of John Cecil Masterman, that will run the double-cross system to copy the German counterintelligence work and deception operations that came after Venlo. Then, on July 22, 1940, the Special Operations Executive, the SOE.
One of the problems with having mainly an signal interception-driven organization is that you have no way to act on the information that you're getting except pass it on to the military and hope that they can do something with it. But what is the military going to do about something that is happening far behind the front? They can't do much. So this is where you get organizations like the Special Operations Executive and the OSS come into play and start actually doing something with the information that you've gathered with the signaling units. And that is very new.
Hugh Dalton, the Minister of Economic Warfare, is given responsibility to create the SOE by forging together the Foreign Office's Department EH in charge of propaganda and the SIS Section D, who gather information and advice on sabotage, propaganda, and irregular warfare. She shall be more than the two, a truly operational force. Churchill's own instructions on the matter are simply, go set Europe ablaze.
Well, let me say this much about Winston Churchill. I think that his personal background as a journalist and as a war hero who had a great escape from prison during the Boer War made him predestined to be the man who lit the lunt on the espionage story of World War II.
While sabotage and covert operations are as old as war, An organization like this is a very new thing. It is the birth of the modern concept of government-employed secret agents that will one day be celebrated in fiction across media through characters like James Bond, Jack Ryan, Jason Bourne, and many more. Around the same time, there is a faltering debate in the US surrounding the creation of a new intelligence service. There are two stumbling blocks. First, opposition to the idea comes from all sides. The Army and Navy, who want to keep their intelligence work firmly in-house. The FBI, who fear any challenge to their prominence. And from some of those in government, who fear the future implications of such an organization. Secondly, there is simply a lack of expertise in the US in how exactly to proceed. They will need support from Britain to rapidly establish a new spy agency. Thankfully, Britain has just the man to send their way, William Little Bill Stevenson. Stevenson is Canadian-born, but moved to Britain in 1922. Back in World War I, he served as a successful fighter pilot in the Royal Flying Corps, where he was awarded the Military Cross and the Distinguished Flying Cross. Since the First World War, he has become an extremely successful businessman and has gotten involved with the intelligence work with the SIS.
Stevenson's story is great because he and Churchill ran the last private organized spy circle when they uncovered all of the rearmament information in the 1930s. Then he goes on to be instrumental in forming the Special Operations Executive and all of the things that he advised in doing there. And Churchill handpicked him to then go to America and recreate the same thing, and then created the OSS. So if you like, you could call Stevenson the godfather of Western espionage.
The British Security Coordination, BSC, is established to assist the Americans, but also to influence the US public in favour of entry into the war, something which Stevenson and the BSC do very effectively. Stevenson is not alone at the BSC. It is a concerted effort sponsored by the SOE, SIS, and Royal Navy Intelligence. Another noteworthy and very influential agent deeply involved in the efforts is Ian Fleming, the later author and creator of James Bond. In any case, in July 1941, with guidance from the BSC, Roosevelt creates the Office of the Coordinator of Information, or OCI, soon to become the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS.
In difference to Great Britain, where Winston Churchill was very much driving the development in espionage, Roosevelt was not an active proponent of either the OSS or, for that matter, any kind of intelligence on that level. He was the president who accepted the information that he got and worked with that. And it was the layers below him that really took the decisions.
The head of this new office will be Wild Bill Donovan, an acquaintance of Stevenson, American war hero and favourite of FDR. Through the BSC, spy schools are established in America, and the OCI opens up shop in England, allowing OCI recruits to train alongside their SOE counterparts. The OCI will continue to expand before being reorganised into the OSS in 1942, maturing as an independent organisation with resources and expertise of its own. Mature is perhaps a strong word though, as the operations are, at least at first, somewhat of a circus. Donovan, true to his moniker Wild Bill, lets flow free his creativity. He has his own mad professor, Boston chemist Stanley P. Lavelle, that Donovan calls Professor Moriarty after the Sherlock Holmes villain. Lavelle runs a department to develop spy and sabotage gadgets that range from the incredibly inventive to the utterly insane. Then, under Donovan's principle that he will employ anyone useful, allegedly saying at one point, "I'd put Stalin on the OSS payroll if I thought it would help defeat Hitler," the OSS becomes inundated with new recruits from every walk of life, from former mafia hitmen to communists to movie stars. The eccentricity leads to a running joke among employees that one line from Macbeth summarizes the organization perfectly. Confusion now has made his masterpiece. While that is all fun and games, both the SOE and OSS will soon see their fair share of serious warfare. In the meantime, cryptography, the more established part of intelligence, is also seeing progress. By the time the OSS is gearing up, US cryptanalysis has made vast strides, quickly learning from its failures at Pearl Harbor. By June 1942, Station Hypo delivers its first big catch. They've been working on cracking Japanese fleet transmissions, encrypted with what Hypo refers to as JN-25. They provide Admiral Chester Nimitz with the Imperial Japanese Navy's complete order of battle for their next big operation, the assault on Midway Atoll, the US Navy base in the North Pacific Ocean. The information read by Hypo is incomplete, but they've broken enough Japanese code in the past to figure out they're talking about something big and something soon. This is enough for Nimitz to take action. Armed and prepared, the Americans inflict a crushing defeat on the Japanese. The Battle of Midway will break the back of the Japanese Navy in a way that it will never recover from. The British don't abandon their cryptography efforts either. The progress in decoding Enigma finally gives them the upper hand in their naval war.
Encryption and decryption was really seen to be the key to winning the Battle of the Atlantic. You really saw advantages that Enigma gave to the Allies, specifically with the anti-submarine campaigns from 1942 and 1943. The pendulum would swing one way than the other. It'd be with the Germans, then it'd be with the Allies, and then decisively with the Allies. The idea that cracking Enigma shortened the war or lessened the Allied death toll or increased the Axis death toll is absolutely 100% true, I think.
However, it is a stony path at first. Elements within and without threaten their smooth operation. Churchill's secret army at the SOE consistently butt heads with just about everyone working alongside them as they pursue their goal of igniting chaos across Nazi-occupied Europe. Stuart Mingers is aggravated. SIS frequently look down on this new organisation as it tries to stand shoulder to shoulder with a service with such a rich and famous history as the SIS. They also frequently complain about aggressive and high-profile SOE operations, drawing the attention of German counterintelligence and prompting crackdowns. The Abwehr, headed by Wilhelm Canaris, the SS intelligence at the SD, and the Gestapo, continue to see success in the Netherlands, and the combined efforts soon bring down disaster on SOE operations in France and other regions, while the SIS frantically try to rebuild their networks and the resistance is trying to operate.
There are a multitude of things that play into the failure of the SOE agents that went into Europe. One was, of course, that the Germans were very smart and they had captured lists and lists, and they continued doing that, and they fooled them into giving up the names of them. So after the Venlo incident and the Englandspiel, the German Abwehr and SD had completely gutted the British capacity to put agents on the ground undiscovered. And this, of course, was transported into France, and every moment an agent landed on French soil, that put hundreds of lives inside of the resistance at risk.
It's tricky and dangerous work. Nonetheless, a marriage between the Allied covert operations and local resistance is paramount.
I think that without the resistance, espionage in Western Europe would have been completely impossible. There was no way to really penetrate the walls of Nazi occupation if you were not already on the inside.
Things are made worse when the SOE fall out with the OSS, which happens especially during the Italian campaign in 43 and 44. While the SOE generally lead operations in Europe, the OSS begin to assert themselves in Italy, where many Italian Americans feel that they should take the lead. This leads to competition between the two agencies to support the Italian partisans, with both delivering aid and carrying out sabotage operations. However, poor communication and a lack of coordination causes frequent blunders and frustration. Meanwhile, the OSS faces internal rivalries, notably with the FBI, with tensions between J. Edgar Hoover and OSS Chief Bill Donovan worsening. The Soviets find themselves with another problem entirely, suffering from success. The NKVD is an organization driven by paranoia.
That system of mistrust and doubt is not only exemplary of Soviet Union intelligence work, but it's exemplary of everything in the entire Soviet government. Stalin is pretty much paranoid about everyone and everything at any time. So he makes sure to never give any one individual or any one institution too much power. He makes sure to play them against each other, and he makes sure to keep everybody in line.
Stalin's own paranoia of the Trotskyist Fourth International has already led to the NKVD perpetrating purges that claim the lives of hundreds of thousands, guilty and innocent. People in the party, in the army, the navy, the air force, even in the NKVD itself. And this paranoia extended too to Soviet assets and networks abroad. Ironically, success is the very source of distrust, leading to the NKVD handlers not believing what they are hearing. The information the cells send back is often so precise and extensive that it leaves the NKVD convinced that the spy ring has been busted and is transmitting false information for their supposed captors. The agents in these networks are often then cut off and disposed of. To make things worse, if you become a successful agent, you may very well pose a threat to your higher-ups.
They wanted to ensure that nobody had too much power, nobody had too much influence, and so it was always a game of checks and balances. If somebody was recalled from an intelligence posting in the United States, for example, and came back, if they were thought of as knowing too much, well, then you go to a labor camp, and then you can't tell anyone.
When Kim Philby of the Cambridge Five reports to the NKVD that Britain's focus is entirely on fighting Germany and does not have a single active asset in the USSR, the NKVD immediately dismiss the report. When Anthony Blunt, embedded in MI5, concurs with Philby and reports that the information is true, that simply places him under suspicion too, as he must also be a part of whatever anti-Soviet conspiracy the British are cooking up. This is the nature of the NKVD's thinking. When they are warned of Germany's impending invasion, and even when the first reports begin coming in from the ground, the NKVD's urge is to question the motives of their source and only then try to verify the information. This paranoia serves to hamstring the NKVD when decisive action could save a lot of hassle, and many Soviet lives are lost over the course of the war as a result of this inaction. But Barbarossa forces them to change tack to some degree. The amount of detailed information passed to Stalin from a wide variety of sources, including Churchill and Roosevelt, should have meant that they took their own spies seriously. The Soviet agent who passes the most precise and urgent information to the Kremlin is arguably Richard Sorge, a German communist who has infiltrated the German military and civilian legations in Japan. In early June 1941, he sends a message to Moscow that he has definitive proof that the German attack will come sometime between June 15th and June 20th. Like the other intelligence on Barbarossa, his warning is ignored, and when the Germans do attack on June 22nd, the Red Army is woefully unprepared.
Yeah, that was just stupid, wasn't it? I mean, everybody told them Barbarossa is going to happen. Anybody could have seen it was going to happen. The Germans planned it nearly 12 months beforehand, but I think it was a case of, I know that this is going to go very badly for me if this happens. There is nothing I can do to prevent this from happening, so I'll just pretend that this cannot be happening.
I think that Richard Sorge was a real wake-up call for Joseph Stalin. He was reporting to the Residentura in Tokyo, and he reported on Barbarossa, and Stalin didn't believe him, and then Barbarossa happened. This showed Stalin and everybody inside of the Soviet Union that you need to listen to your agents. I would call it one of the pivotal success stories because it created awareness inside of the Soviet Union of what greatness they sat upon if we're talking about espionage networks.
In Germany, the issues plaguing their own foreign intelligence service, the Abwehr, are more internal. The Abwehr predates the Nazis by some margin, being formed in 1920. Since January 1st, 1935, the Abwehr has been headed by World War I veteran and naval officer Admiral Wilhelm Canaris. Canaris, like many in Germany in the interwar period, is a German nationalist and patriot who is sickened and shamed by his nation's status in the world following Versailles. When Hitler came to power, Canaris was not convinced of the Nazi promises and propaganda, but he was willing to give them a chance. Although he did not share their beliefs, he thought that they may be able to bring Germany back to the fore of the world stage, and if they could, then he would support them, although more as a political ally than a disciple of Hitler's.
First of all, I think Wilhelm Canaris intentionally was and is an enigma. It's really hard to pinpoint his true intentions. However, I think his efforts to rebuild the Abwehr were actually genuine in the interest of Germany. He wanted to heal what was done with the Treaty of Versailles. He wanted to restore German greatness and the German army complex.
Canaris and many other Germans soon found out, though, that when dealing with an ideological force like the Nazis, one cannot simply harness their energy and bargain with them and expect it to end there. Canaris watched on in horror as the Nazis proceeded to unleash their wrath on Jews and other minorities, while the party machinery became more and more intertwined with the Wehrmacht, and an aggressive foreign policy was pursued that Canaris believed could only lead to the destruction of Germany. Canaris and his closest confidants respond to this by doing their best to limit the progress of the Nazi war machine and assist the Western Allies where possible. Canaris hopes that Germany will be able to negotiate a separate peace with the West, should the opportunity to eliminate Hitler arise. Canaris and some of his subordinates, in particular Hans Oster, lead double lives throughout this period.
Beginning in 1938, I think Wilhelm Canaris for sure had a double agenda.
But perhaps even without Canaris' double dealing, the Abwehr started slipping.
The failure of Abwehr intelligence operations, sometimes it was just incompetence. Sometimes it was a clash of various interests within the Abwehr, within the Wehrmacht. Some operations were just so rushed that there was no time at all to brief them properly or to train them properly. But sometimes I ask myself, maybe that was intentional too.
Even before the war started, the Abwehr made an attempt to create a spy network in the US. The plan was to gather information about the US military industry and potentially conduct sabotage. One of the embedded agents, who was blackmailed into participation in this operation by the Germans, immediately turned to the FBI, and after 2 years of surveillance and investigations, the spy ring is dismantled, with 33 members arrested and brought to trial. Despite, or perhaps thanks to Canaris' efforts, the next attempt to infiltrate the US was also a failure.
I think a very, very good example for the mindset or how these operations were put together was Operation Pistorius. So they assembled a team, put in a U-boat, sent them to the United States to commit sabotage. They made it to shore, made it to New York, only to get to this bizarre moment where one of the operation leaders invites the other one to his hotel room, opens the window, asks, "What's your stand on the Nazi Empire?" You answer, "Now I will determine whether I throw you out of the window or not." So the other one was a little bit tense at that very moment. And then he said, "I hate them." And that doomed the whole operation. These were the kind of people they sent over. So whoever recruited them likely in a rush. And I think that was more the norm than the exception.
some actions on the part of Canaris and Oster would be considered downright treasonous. They warned Britain of Hitler's intentions in Poland, warned the Dutch of the impending outflanking of the French via a thrust through the Benelux, and advised Spanish dictator Francisco Franco against joining the Axis. The Abwehr, of course, is not a monolith either, and does contain both anti- and pro-Nazi officers, so their actions at the very top will need to be kept secret even from some of their direct subordinates. On top of that, Canaris will need to continue delivering at least some results to stay at the head of the Abwehr, and stop the SS and SD from persuading Hitler to put them in charge of intelligence.
The relationship between the Abwehr and the SD was sometimes a pretend of friendly cooperation. They were always rivals, and that had a lot to do with the personal ambitions. I do believe that Schellenberg really genuinely liked Canaris. He just was an inquiry obstacle. Schellenberg saw an opportunity for him, and he felt, okay, if I am able to bring the whole German intelligence community under the SD umbrella, I will rise even higher. The SD, again, was, contrary to the Abwehr, full of dedicated Nazis. Nevertheless, especially when you get closer to the end of the war, they became more concerned saving their own skin.
In the end, the Nazi German espionage world collapses in two phases. First as a victim of its own cannibalism, and then with the looming defeat of the Nazis. By mid-1944, the Abwehr is gone, with Canaris and Oster soon in concentration camps, and the SD is unable to rebuild intelligence operations to the level of the early days of the war. All in all, the German contribution to the birth of modern espionage, while undeniable, remains as an inspiration for the Allies, both by copying some of their methods and by providing an enemy to develop new methods against. The place that this arguably comes together is in how the double-cross system develops under its operational leader, Thomas Argyle Robertson.
It was a system for counter-espionage at the beginning, but after a while, it was introduced and grown as a deception organization.
The operatives that come from the German Reich to Great Britain are caught pretty much immediately because the British have this double-cross network, and they are informed by, turned former German agents who's coming, when they're coming, where they're coming. So pretty much all of them are picked up immediately. The big thing is that the British intelligence services recognize that these individuals can be used.
By the end of 1942, there is not a single German spy in Great Britain that hasn't been caught, imprisoned, or turned. Under the direction of Tar Robertson, the British then use this to exert absolute control over the supply of information to Germany, making sure that the former Nazi spies report things slightly too late to be of any use, lacking in crucial details, or otherwise easily misinterpreted. This ensures that the Germans still believe the network is functioning well, reporting many verifiable truths, albeit useless ones, thereby protecting the cover of the system.
There was not a single spy that fell back, to the Germans as a double agent. No one. Tar Robertson was not only a very fashionable guy, he had a lot of social skills. He was so good in developing personal relationships that after a while they had such a lot of trust that they would not have betrayed him.
The British then used the German blindness to enact two elaborate operations to misdirect Axis forces in preparation for the landings at Sicily and Normandy, Mincemeat and Fortitude. Mincemeat involves getting hold of a corpse that would not be missed, in this case that of Glyndŵr Michael, a Welsh homeless man. From there, a fake military identity is manufactured and bogus invasion plans aimed at the Balkans are planted onto the corpse, which is then allowed to quietly drift into Axis hands by way of the Spanish. Operation Fortitude is a little less outlandish, but equally or perhaps even more impressive. Non-existent armies are created, and radio chatter is simulated by both military and civilian sources to maintain the illusion. Information fed back to Germany through Double Cross seems to verify the existence of these armies, and suggests that the main British targets are Norway, Calais, the Mediterranean coast, or the Atlantic coast. The goal is to distract Hitler from the actual landings in Calvados, Normandy. Both operations ultimately succeed, and Axis find many of their troops spread out across Europe, hundreds, if not thousands, of miles away from where they need them.
I think without the double-cross system, D-Day wouldn't have happened in the successful way it did.
That really leads to the British intelligence services learning a lot for the future about counter-espionage, counterintelligence, and turning enemy agents. And it also establishes this sort of precedent that no, spies should not be immediately executed. They should first be used, and if they can't be used, then we can execute them.
Despite all these successes, the track records of the organizations created during the war remains mixed. Their true impact on the war remains debatable. They have been spectacular and fascinating without a doubt, but while successful in some cases, they have been disastrous and costly in human lives in many others. What is undeniable is that they have changed the nature of intelligence forever. In a few short years, the work of espionage has gone from simple observation to grand schemes and larger-than-life gambits that, if carried out correctly, can help decide the outcome of battles and even theatres of war before a single shot has been fired.
The goal of any conflict is to never let it escalate to war, but to resolve it peacefully. And one of the only ways to do that is to make sure that you are speaking to the enemy as the enemy wants to be spoken to. How do you do that? Well, you do that by understanding the enemy, and intelligence is all about understanding the enemy. So that both sides gather intelligence on each other is essential for diplomacy to work.
But in mid-1945, as the war ends in Europe and marches towards its end in East Asia, this is not yet a lesson learned. Instead, the Western Allies begin dismantling their newborn networks. The 20 Committee ceases its activities in the summer of 1945, the OSS is disbanded in September, and the SOE in January 46. While there are already forces that argue for a continued strong, actionable Operation Intelligence Arm in Great Britain and the US, there is no strong consensus that such organizations are needed in a time of general peace. Then, something happens in Canada. Mere days after the surrender of Japan, a Soviet cipher clerk by the name Igor Guzenko defects to the Western Allies, bringing with him a generous cache of confidential Soviet documents.
The effect of it was that he gave all the information of every Russian spy that was working in Canada. Actually, when you ask me like this, he was the one who started the Cold War, because after the Canadians realized what was actually going on and what Stalin really did with his allies, right? That was it.
A couple of months later, Elizabeth Bentley, a handler for the vast network of Soviet spies in the US, follows in his footsteps and defects to the FBI.
Suddenly, the Allies are aware that there is a sizable and professional infiltration underpinning most of the Western institutions of Soviet agents. And it really sets the stage for this Cold War behind-the-scenes conflict that we see throughout the 50s, 60s, and so on.
The curtain has been pulled away, and the Soviet Kraken that stretches its communist tentacles into every aspect of Western society is revealed. Even the West's most closely guarded secret, the Manhattan Project, has been unable to escape the far-reaching tendrils of the NKVD. Stalin is briefed about it in March 1942. The NKVD then set about infiltrating it, but failed to do so in a meaningful way until 1943, when the nuclear programs of the USA and UK emerged. A certain physicist, a German refugee by the name of Klaus Fuchs, is transferred from Britain to Los Alamos. Little do the Allies know, but Fuchs has been working for the NKVD for years.
He thought if the Allies were able to build a bomb and would be the only country in possession of that weapon, that would be disastrous, because you never know whether any kind of crazy dictator, and he experienced Hitler, would be the only one to have it. And he thought, for me, Klaus Fuchs, the only goal is the Germans can't have it. And I'm working a little bit for the Soviets and their allies in America. So why don't I try to give the information to both so that there is a balance of power?
Once again, the NKVD's vast networks have borne fruit.
The Soviets did a fantastic job at that. You got to give them credit for that. And they were very ruthless. I think they were more ruthless, certainly, than the Americans or British would have been if the situation had been reversed.
The scale of Soviet infiltration was really quite remarkable in many ways. The Western Allies were not completely oblivious to some Soviet infiltration. For example, in Britain, in the years between 1941 and 1945, the British intelligence agencies knew that there were Soviet agents there, but they just didn't really appreciate or wanted to see the true scale of things.
Within weeks of Guzenko's defection, any doubts about a post-war need for powerful intelligence organizations are gone. The SIS will grow and expand. The OSS will be revived as the CIA, and a string of agencies under a new effort to combine all intelligence work in the US under the Director of Central Intelligence. In the Soviet Union, the NKVD will soon be reformed and lead to the creation of the KGB. Many other nations will soon follow suit, with the French DGSE, the Israeli Mossad, the Chinese Central Investigation Department, and so on. During the Cold War, these agencies will go far beyond spying and actually fight each other in proxy wars in places like Korea, Laos, Afghanistan, Congo, Angola, and more. They will destabilize foreign governments to increase their nation's influence by seeding coups with espionage, infiltration, misinformation, and assassination. They will guide world events and change the course of history. They will fight each other using double agents, triple agents, and deep moles. The age of the super spy, agents and organizations existing with the power to change the course of wars, politics, the very future has arrived.
Throughout the Second World War, agencies have evolved. Lessons have been learned. When Henry Stimson called espionage ungentlemanly back in 1929, he may have been entirely correct. Unfortunately for him, the age of gentlemen is over. This is the age of scoundrels, tricksters, thieves, conmen, liars, and cheats. The age of James Bond. Nations have discovered how to fight dirty behind the scenes against the backdrop of a larger, brutal conflict. And now, espionage is about to take its final logical step, fighting wars unknown to the world at large during times of nominal peace.
I think the world of espionage makes the world a better place. I mean, it makes politicians more careful. If you have information about what the enemy has in mind, you might consider again.
In my opinion, espionage saved more lives in World War II than it cost. It helps you from making mistakes, and any mistake in a war will be costly.
The role and the growth of international espionage during the war should be revised. It should be looked at far more deeply because I believe it has a far longer lasting effect on the world post-1945 than the cracking of Enigma has. The cracking of Enigma may have shortened the war, may have won some battles, and may have helped with the Battle of the Atlantic thing, but the espionage organizations really provided a framework for an entire future world. This is not a world that existed by any stretch of imagination like that pre-war. You had rudimentary in the beginnings of intelligence organizations, sure, but no, this is a far more important legacy from the Second World War.